about if somebody sees his children speaking, gossiping, speaking Lashon Hara? What do? How do you respond? You say, well, they're only children. Dismiss it. It's okay. It's immaturity. You know, the Torah tells us there's a case in the Torah, which we read about it right before Rosh Hashanah. There's the discussion about the rebellious child. He's known as Ben Sora Moreh. He's a boy who just became bar mitzvah. It's within the 3-month period, he's just become bar mitzvah, and he steals from his parents, and he buys a certain amount of meat and wine. And the parents find out about it. The Torah says when this happens, the parents have an obligation to take the child to the court, to the rabbinic court, what we call the Sanhedrin, and they give him lashes for this type of behavior. And they warn him, and they say, you become a repeated offender and do it again, you'll be put to death. That's what they tell this 13-year-old boy. He's not even 13 and 3 months yet. And he becomes a repeated offender. And the parents, again, bring their child to the court, and the court puts the child to death. Now, firstly, for stealing doesn't have the liability of the death penalty. Why this particular situation? Why does the Torah say he should be put to death? Because the Torah is telling you factually that this child is developing an addiction, and eventually, if he's not going to be able to support his habit, he's going to become a highwayman, a bandit, and eventually he's going to kill. And even though right now he's only stealing, eventually he'll be killed for committing murder. Therefore, better, his life should be taken earlier than later, less guilty than more guilty. That's the case. That's the model case in the Torah. So the Gemara says, the Mishnah says, that this never ever happened. Never happened. Never happened. Why? So the Talmud explains, because if you read the script of this scenario of the child, to meet all the criteria is impossible. The father, the mother, the voices have to be the same, the parents have to look alike. There's so many details which are not possible to meet those details, those criteria. Therefore, you can never convict a child for this type of behavior. So the Talmud asks, so why does the Torah write it? So what's the point of writing? If it's something which is not relevant and not applicable, why does the Torah write it? So the Gemara tells us, lidrosh l'kabel schar, to study it and to receive reward for studying the subject. So the commentators ask, the law is that when you say Kriya Shema twice a day in the morning, you have to say it within a certain period of time. If you say it too late, one has not fulfilled his obligation of saying the Shema. So, the Mishnah tells us if you said it after the expiration time, you still get credit, because since there are verses in the Torah, you get credit for studying Torah. So over here it says, why? In reality, this narrative cannot ever come to fruition, can never happen. So you should study it to receive reward. So receive reward, I could say a portion of Torah and receive reward for study of Torah. So the commentator says, no, that's not the case. It's to draw a lesson from here. Draw a lesson. What's the lesson we draw? Whoever heard of parents taking the child to court, knowing he's going to be lashed, receive lashes, and if he becomes a repeated offender, he even be put to death? Whoever heard of such a thing? It's unheard of. But why do if parents do it, why do they do it? They do it out of love for God, which is in essence love for their child. Because if the child ultimately is going to be that bandit, that murderer, better he should be put to death in an innocent state, relatively speaking, than a more culpable state. So they're willing to suppress their own love for that child for the sake of God. So this is a mini Akedah story. Avram was told to take his most beloved child and bring him as a sacrifice. And he did. And that was the most difficult test. And the fruits that it paid off of that test that he was able to meet the challenge is phenomenal. So if a parent or anybody is challenged, even with that, to do something of such special dimension for the sake of God, it's something exceptional. That's the lesson you should draw from this. But again, let's say the parents don't do it. What do? They dismiss it. Immaturity. He just returned to bar mitzvah. I just spent $50,000 on his bar mitzvah party. right? Prestige caterers, just had it. Just paid, I mortgaged my house for it. He's immature. Does he understand? Does he even appreciate what I did for him? He's immature. So what does the parent do? He dismisses it. It's immaturity. You want to know something? You have something here festering that God forbid, that if you don't nip it in the bud, God forbid, your child will be uncontrollable. And he'll become a criminal. And ultimately, he's going to be incarcerated, maybe even put to death. Be smart. Meet the challenge, see what it is, and address it and correct it if you can. Many people, when they raise their children, as a young child, you're still able to make a difference in your child's life. If you let it go out of hand, out of control, after a certain age, you can't speak to your child any longer. You can't, because then the decision is a much more difficult decision. Do you put your child out of your home, or do you actually let your child be there and behave in this belligerent, disrespectful, rebellious way? What do? But if the parent would have been smart and nipped it in the bud when the child was 6, 7 years old, even before that, to teach the child proper values and to give the child an understanding of what that other thing means, the child would have stayed away from that. And you would have been monitoring his social group, his friends. What kind of kids did he hang around with? Dismiss it. It doesn't make a difference. It's this, it's that, whatever it is. But it does make a difference. And ultimately, God forbid, it comes to haunt the parents and haunt the family and even destroys the family because of this. So the Chafetz Chaim says, when you have small children and they come home and they want to tell you something which has gossip value, nothing more than that, you have to begin mentoring your children to tell them in a gentle, loving way, it's not appropriate. It's not, we don't say those things. We don't do those things. Child lies. And you want some children, unfortunately, they're literally liars. They become pathological liars because they were never taught when they were young. They never said truths. They said whole truths, half truths, whatever it was. A parent has that responsibility. You bring a child into existence, you have an obligation to raise that child responsibly, not to create something which, God forbid, will be a detriment to himself and to society and to God. So the Chafetz Chaim says, they have no liability, they're minors. They're not culpable for their misbehavior, but it doesn't make a difference. Factually, they're being conditioned to do things that they shouldn't do. You go into a store and all of a sudden you see your child has, years ago, because the child was in the cart, when you're shopping, all of a sudden you see your child has a package of Lifesavers or Charms or Tootsie Roll. So where did you get that from? I took it off the counter as we walked by. So what do? Immediately you give it back, you pay for it, and you explain to the child, you can't do this. Does it again. Sometimes you have to reprimand it. You have to slap the child on his wrist, on his hand, to understand it's unacceptable. You have to communicate this behavior will not be tolerated in a loving way, not to do it in a way where you're going to drive the child away, but it has to be addressed. Gossiping, saying things which are inappropriate, when the child becomes an adult who'll continue this way, it's as a result of the irresponsible behavior of the parent. The parent was negligent, didn't raise his child properly. It's very interesting. On a Torah level, a father has an obligation to study Torah with his son. But there's what we call chinuch. What is chinuch? Chinuch means that when a child becomes of age, as a minor, whatever mitzvah he could do, you're supposed to start mentoring the child in that mitzvah. That he should be conditioned. For instance, the Gemara says, Talmud says, when a child reaches the age that he's able to put on a pair of tzitzis, you should buy your child a pair of tzitzis. A four-cornered garment with the fringes on it. When he's able to wave a lulav, the 4 species on sukkahs, he has the mechanical skills that he's able to hold it and wave it, you should give him the lulav. That he should be trained to do this. And as he reaches various milestones of development, and he's able to do something, you begin training him, mentoring him, and conditioning him that he should act and function within that capacity. Why? Because once he's conditioned to do things at a certain age, as an adult, he will continue to do them properly. Shlomo says, Chanoch l'nara pidarko. Every child has to be, there's no 2 children the same. Even though the same parents, children have the nuances of difference, or even more than nuances of difference. Each child has to be mentored and educated and be dealt with differently. One child, you have to be maybe a little sterner because the child naturally doesn't have a capacity to appreciate what's gentle. Children naturally are very possessive. I don't use the word selfish. It's mine, and they don't share. And parents have to teach a child that you're supposed to share with others, with their siblings, even with others. It's mine, it's his. No, you have to share. So everything is what, I once mentioned that every child who's born, they're born with their fist closed. And when a person dies, whatever it's meant to be, the person dies with his hand open, palm open. So the Talmud tells us that when a person dies, leaves this world, 50% of your aspirations have been achieved. We want taking the whole world. So when you're born with that clenched fist. You want it all. When a person dies, he realizes he leaves with nothing. You don't even leave with 50% of your aspirations in terms of what you wanted to accomplish. So they say on the Chafetz Chaim that when he passed away at the age of this question, 99, 103, he passed away, his fist was clenched. He took the whole world with him because in terms of what he was meant to accomplish, he succeeded in his objective was to be who he was. Like we find by Yaakov when he had the discussion with Esav and he sent him this very valuable gift, the herds, the flocks, and Esav says to Yaakov, "What did you send this to me?" He says, "To find favor in your eyes." So he says, "But I nearly have it all." Yaakov says to Esav, "But I do have it all." Meaning whatever I have it all. And whatever more I have, I thank God for giving you more. But as much as I have, I always have it all. And that's what it's about.